The sound of my mother striking my husband across the face echoed through the vaulted ceilings of her Boston dining room. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. The jazz music playing softly in the background suddenly felt like a sick joke. She pointed a trembling, diamond-clad finger at him and screamed that he would always be trailer trash. I did not scream back. I did not cry. I simply stood up, took my husband and my 7-year-old daughter, and walked out into the freezing snow. My family thought I was just throwing a tantrum. They thought I would come crawling back to fix their problems like I always did. They had no idea that when I closed their heavy oak front door, I was officially resigning from my role as their savior and preparing to pull the financial floor right out from under them. My name is Hannah. I am 34 years old, and until that exact second, I had spent my entire adult life acting as the personal janitor for my family, mistakes debts, and manufactured crises. As the director of operations for a national healthcare group, I am used to managing disasters, but nothing prepared me for the disaster of my own family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Growing up in Boston meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling estate, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My parents, Brenda and Thomas, obsessed over one thing above all else: social standing. They played the part of old money elites flawlessly. But behind closed doors, their financial reality was a fragile house of cards. They spent money they did not have to impress people who did not care. The golden child was my older brother Logan. He could do no wrong. His crowning achievement in my parents' eyes was marrying his wife Whitney. Whitney is a stunning Black African-American woman from a deeply established East Coast political dynasty. To my mother, Whitney was absolute royalty. She brought political prestige and legitimate wealth to Logan. It did not matter that Logan was running his investment firm straight into the ground. My parents practically worshipped the ground Whitney walked on. Then there was me. I was the workhorse, and my husband Jake was their favorite target. Jake is 35 years old. He grew up in a trailer park in Texas. He worked his way up from pouring concrete to owning a massive commercial construction and real estate empire. But to my parents and Whitney, he was just a blue-collar worker who got lucky. They refused to see his intelligence or his massive success. They only saw a man who did not fit into their pretentious country club lifestyle. The tension reached its absolute breaking point at my parents' lavish Christmas dinner. The dining room was suffocatingly hot, filled with the scent of roasted duck and expensive pine candles. My 7-year-old daughter Lily was happily coloring at the kids' table in the corner. We were seated at the main mahogany table. Jake was quietly cutting his food, trying to ignore the constant passive-aggressive remarks my mother had been making all evening. Then Whitney decided to chime in. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her vintage champagne and looked Jake up and down with utter disdain. She set her crystal glass down and sneered right at him. She said the smell of manual labor in trailer parks can never truly be washed out, not even by an Armani suit. She asked him directly if he felt out of place here. The table went dead silent. I gripped my napkin, my blood boiling. I was about to defend him, but Jake did not need my protection. He gently set his fork down, wiped his mouth, and offered Whitney a perfectly calm, polite smile. He looked right into her eyes and said he felt completely fine. Then he added that maintaining a political dynasty must be exhausting when Logan's investment firm has been operating in the red for 3 consecutive quarters. It was a brilliant, precise response, and it was entirely true. Whitney's face drained of all color. She gasped, completely humiliated. Logan stared down at his plate, absolutely silent, too cowardly to defend the truth and too weak to say a single word. But the truth is the ultimate offense in my family. My mother Brenda leaped out of her chair. Her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Before anyone could blink, she marched over to Jake, raised her hand, and slapped him hard across the left cheek. The sound cracked like a whip. Jake did not flinch. He just stared at her, completely unbothered. Brenda pointed her shaking finger toward the hallway. She screamed that he would always be trailer trash. She ordered him to take his daughter and get out of her house. She shrieked that she would not have uncultured garbage disrespecting her daughter-in-law at her Christmas table. I sat frozen for exactly 1 second. I looked at my mother, her face red with rage. I looked at Whitney, who was now smirking victoriously. I realized right then that they cared infinitely more about Whitney's elite status than basic human respect for the man I loved. I had spent years quietly funding their fake lifestyle. Every time Logan overdrew his accounts, I was the one who quietly moved funds. Every time my mother's credit cards were declined at her luxury boutiques, I was the one who negotiated with the bank. I was the invisible safety net keeping their Titanic from sinking. But in return, they treated my husband like dirt on their shoes. Seeing that red mark on Jake's cheek broke the final thread of loyalty I had left. I realized that giving them my resources was not helping them, it was just enabling their abuse. I calmly set my napkin down on the table. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or argue. I turned to my husband and told him to go upstairs and get Lily, and that we were leaving. Brenda started shrieking again, warning me that if I walked out that door, I was disrespecting the family forever. I ignored her entirely. Jake carried Lily down the stairs. I grabbed our coats. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing Boston snow. The heavy thud of the door closing behind us was the best sound I had ever heard. The morning sun filtered through the frost-covered windows of our own home. I sat at our kitchen island, wrapping my hands around a warm mug of black coffee. The heavy thud of my parents' front door from the night before still echoed in my mind, but it had quickly been replaced by a much better sound. The sound of Jake laughing with our daughter. Jake stood by the stove flipping pancakes. He wore a simple gray shirt and sweatpants. When he turned to hand Lily a plate, the bright morning light caught the side of his face. A distinct purplish-red bruise had already bloomed across his left cheek, where my mother had struck him. He did not complain about the pain. He did not bring up the humiliating event. He just smiled warmly at Lily and poured maple syrup onto her plate in the shape of a smiley face. That was the man my elite family had the nerve to call trailer trash. A man who absorbed a vicious physical blow from a wealthy Boston snob and woke up the next morning completely focused on making his little girl smile. I watched him and felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe that wealth and status equaled class. I had spent 34 years contorting myself into a human shield to protect my family and their precious reputation. I was the one who smoothed over their financial blunders, covered their bounced checks, and managed the logistics of their chaotic, debt-fueled lives. I did it because I was taught that family loyalty meant endless sacrifice. But seeing that bruise on my husband changed my DNA. Loyalty to abusers is just self-destruction. At exactly 7:15, the serene quiet of our kitchen was shattered. My cell phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop. The screen lit up with a caller ID I knew all too well. Mom. I stared at the glowing screen. A tiny, naive fraction of my brain wondered if she was calling to apologize. Perhaps the cold light of day had made her realize the absolute insanity of assaulting her son-in-law. Perhaps seeing us walk out into the snow had triggered some dormant maternal instinct. I knew better, but I answered anyway. I did not say hello. I just pressed the phone to my ear and waited. The line immediately erupted into hysterical, frantic sobbing, but it was not the sound of a mother consumed by regret. It was the sound of a narcissist who had just been inconvenienced. "Hannah, you have to fix this right now!" Brenda screamed into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, completely lacking any warmth or remorse. "The bank just froze Logan's corporate accounts, all of them. And the event coordinator for the New Year charity gala just called me. My platinum card was declined for the floral arrangements. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? The florist told me my card was rejected. You need to call the bank immediately. Tell them to authorize the overrides." I closed my eyes. A cold, hollow realization washed over me, chilling me to the bone. She slapped my husband yesterday. She assaulted him in front of our child, called him garbage, and kicked us out into the winter night. And her very first instinct this morning was to call me and demand that I fix her credit limit so she could buy imported orchids for a party. "You slapped my husband, Mom," I said. My voice was completely devoid of emotion. It sounded foreign even to my own ears. "You assaulted him in front of our daughter. You called him trailer trash. And your first priority today is to ask me to fix your gala venue." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Hannah, stop being so dramatic," Brenda snapped. The fake tears vanished instantly. Her tone shifted from hysterical to venomous and commanding. "That was just the heat of the moment. I was under a lot of pressure. Whitney has her final dress fitting this afternoon, and her card bounced at the boutique. Logan is furious. Whitney is upset, and Logan's image is incredibly sensitive right now. You know how important this charity gala is for our social standing in the city. You cannot possibly let a petty argument with a contractor ruin your family in our time of need. Now pick up your phone, call your contact at the bank, and authorize the funds." I listened to her incredibly arrogant words. A petty argument with a contractor. She did not even view Jake as a human being, let alone my husband. She viewed him as the help a disposable peasant who should be grateful to stand in her dining room. She viewed me as an ATM, a compliant employee whose only purpose was to fund her delusions of grandeur. She genuinely believed I would cave. She thought I would sigh, pick up the phone, call the bank manager I had a relationship with, and manually push her transactions through like I had done dozens of times before. She thought I was still the obedient daughter, terrified of her wrath. I looked at Jake. He was watching me now, a spatula in his hand, his eyes filled with quiet, steady support. He did not tell me what to do. He trusted me to handle it. I brought the phone back to my mouth. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air of my own home. No. The silence on the line was absolute. For a second, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her sharp intake of breath. "What did you say to me?" she whispered. I said no. I replied, my voice hard as diamond. "I am not fixing Logan's accounts. I am not overriding your credit limit. Do not ever call this number again." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. I ended the call, leaving my mother in stunned, horrified silence. Exactly 3 seconds passed. The kitchen was quiet again, save for the sizzle of batter hitting the hot griddle and Lily giggling at something Jake whispered to her. Then my phone vibrated. It did not stop. It buzzed against the marble countertop with the frantic, sustained intensity of a fire alarm. I did not pick it up immediately. I watched the screen light up, displaying notification after notification. They had moved to the family group chat, a chat I had tried to leave multiple times over the years, only to be added back by my father under the guise of family communication. Today, it was a firing squad. I finally picked up the device. My thumb swiped across the glass, opening the floodgates of their delusion. Logan was the first to strike. His messages came through in rapid, panicked bursts. He demanded to know what the hell was wrong with me. He typed that Mom was having a literal panic attack in the foyer. He complained that Whitney needed her custom dress fitted today for the gala, and her card had just bounced at the most exclusive boutique in the city. He ordered me to call the bank. He did not ask. He commanded. He wrote that his reputation was on the line and that I was purposely trying to embarrass him in front of his powerful in-laws. Then came my father. Thomas always preferred the tone of a disappointed corporate dictator. He typed that my behavior was absolutely unacceptable. He stated that I was punishing my mother for a minor disagreement and acting like an emotional teenager. He commanded me to fix the accounts before Logan lost face with Whitney's family. He added that family covers for family and that my petty grievances with my mother had no place in business matters. But it was Whitney who delivered the masterpiece of entitlement. Whitney, who had sat in my mother's dining room and mocked my husband's very existence. Her message popped up on the screen, dripping with the unearned arrogance of a woman who had never worked a day in her life. She wrote that I was truly a petty, miserable woman. She typed that I should be on my knees thanking my mother that she did not call the police on my husband for insulting her family's political legacy. She ended her tirade with a simple, chilling command: "Fix the cards, now." I stared at the glowing text bubbles. Not a single word of concern for Jake. Not a single apology for the physical violence my mother had inflicted. They did not even view the assault as a problem. They viewed my refusal to be their financial servant as the actual crime. Reading their vicious demands, a grim realization settled over me. They truly had no idea how their own lives were funded. They lived in such a thick bubble of manufactured elitism that they had forgotten the actual architecture of their wealth. They forgot what happened 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Logan's boutique investment firm was on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. He had made catastrophic market bets to try and impress Whitney's old money parents. He lost everything. My parents had drained their own savings to cover his initial losses, desperate to maintain the facade of the wealthy, flawless Boston family. When the banks prepared to call in the loans and publicly ruin them, my mother came to me. She wept. She begged. She told me that if Logan lost his firm, Whitney would leave him and the family would be a laughingstock. At the time, I was rapidly ascending the corporate ladder. My income was substantial. My credit was spotless. My financial history was a fortress. So, like the obedient daughter I was trained to be, I stepped in to save them. I did not just make a phone call to smooth things over. I signed a personal guarantee. That personal guarantee was the only reason Chase and Bank of America had allowed Logan's firm to restructure its debt. It was the only reason my mother was granted those massive platinum credit lines. My signature, my corporate status, and my pristine financial health were the invisible safety net keeping their entire fraudulent lifestyle afloat. I was the vault door. They thought the money was theirs. They thought they were the elite. They had completely blocked out the fact that I was legally and financially carrying them on my back. Whitney believed her platinum card was a birthright. Logan believed his corporate accounts were the result of his business acumen. Thomas believed his country club dinners were funded by his own success. They had deluded themselves into believing the lie they sold to the public. They thought I just pressed a pause button out of spite today. They did not realize that I possessed the power to permanently demolish the foundation they stood on. I read Whitney's text one last time. Fix the cards. Now. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I did not type a response. I did not justify my decision or demand an apology. Engaging with them would only validate their delusion that this was a negotiation. It was not a negotiation. It was an eviction. I pressed the power button on the side of my phone. I held it down until the screen went completely black. I tossed the useless piece of metal onto the counter. I walked back into the center of the kitchen. Jake was setting a plate of steaming pancakes in front of Lily. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, completely present, completely unaffected by the venomous people who shared my last name. He looked up and caught my eye. He did not ask what my mother had said. He knew. I walked past the kitchen island and headed straight for my home office. I grabbed my laptop, brought it back to the kitchen table, and sat down. I opened the screen. I connected to the secure network and opened my browser. With steady, deliberate keystrokes, I navigated to my secure banking portal. The time for being the family janitor was over. It was time to take out the trash. The rest of the weekend passed in a state of absolute digital silence on my end. I did not log into my secure banking portal to authorize their funds. I logged in to officially freeze my side of the authorization, putting a hard stop on any emergency overrides. I spent Sunday building a snowman with Lily and watching football with Jake, ignoring the increasingly frantic emails and voicemails pouring into my work phone. By the time Monday morning rolled around, the financial drought had fully set in for my family. My corner office sat high above downtown Boston, enclosed in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the city. As the director of operations for a national healthcare group, my workspace reflected my reality. It was clean, efficient, and earned through years of relentless hard work. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a quarterly budget report when the heavy glass door flew open. My assistant, a highly capable woman who rarely looked flustered, was practically jogging to keep up with the intruder. She apologized hastily, saying he barged right past the reception desk. I raised a hand, signaling for her to step back. I already knew who it was. My father. Thomas stood in the center of my office. His face was a deep mottled red, and his chest heaved as if he had sprinted up all 30 flights of stairs. He slammed his expensive leather briefcase onto the pristine surface of my desk. He did not ask how my weekend was. He did not ask how his granddaughter was doing. He did not apologize for my mother slapping my husband. He demanded to know why I had ignored their calls all weekend. His voice boomed off the glass walls, vibrating with an entitled fury that I had spent my entire life trying to placate. He leaned heavily on his hands, glaring down at me. He told me that I had absolutely no idea what kind of humiliation my brother endured yesterday. He painted a picture of absolute social tragedy. Logan and Whitney had gone to their exclusive country club for Sunday brunch with Whitney's powerful parents. When the bill arrived, Logan confidently handed the waiter his corporate card. It was declined. He handed them a second card, declined again. Thomas shouted that Whitney's father, a prominent black politician with decades of East Coast old money prestige, had to pull out his own wallet to pay for their meals. My father slammed his fist on my desk. He ordered me to call the bank and authorize the funds immediately. He stated that he was no longer asking, he was commanding. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and steepled my fingers. I looked at the man who had raised me to be a financial human shield. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of the daughter who used to fear his temper. I told him that I did not think he understood how the banking system actually worked. I reminded him that I did not own Chase Bank or Bank of America. I was simply the guarantor. I was the one holding the safety net, and I had just decided to step out of the way. That was when Thomas completely lost what little composure he had left. The mask of the refined elite Boston gentleman dissolved, revealing the desperate parasitic man underneath. He began to pace in front of my desk, waving his arms frantically. He yelled that I was the only reason those lines of credit existed. He screamed that Logan needed that money desperately. He reminded me as if I had somehow forgotten that Logan had married Whitney. He demanded to know if I understood what her family represented in this city. He said her African-American political dynasty brought a level of prestige to our name that money could not even buy, and therefore Logan needed the financial foundation to match her status. He stopped pacing and lunged forward, planting both hands flat on my desk. He leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee and panic on his breath. His eyes narrowed with pure, unadulterated contempt. He snarled that the resources of this family must go to Logan. He reiterated that Logan had married Whitney, a woman of grace and influence. Then he looked around my sleek professional office with a look of absolute disgust. He spat out that I had married a trash collector, a man who poured concrete and wore work boots. He stated that Jake did not need to impress anyone, and therefore I did not need social standing. I did not need the family capital. My only job was to ensure Logan had the wealth to maintain his elite facade. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the quiet air of my office. This was the deep cut, the ultimate confirmation of my place in their world. They did not love me. They did not respect my husband. They viewed my marriage, my career, and my very existence as nothing more than a utility to fund the golden child. My father had just looked me in the eye and declared that my husband was worthless and that my money belonged to my brother. A strange, icy calm washed over me. The last remaining chain of guilt I felt toward my parents snapped and dissolved into dust. I did not yell back. I did not cry. I simply smiled. It was a slow, dangerous smile. The kind of smile that makes a predator realize they have just walked into a trap. Thomas stopped breathing heavily and stared at me, a flicker of genuine uncertainty finally crossing his arrogant face. He expected tears. He expected me to break down, apologize for being selfish, and immediately pull up my banking portal to fix their manufactured emergency. Instead, I reached across my desk. I picked up the sleek black receiver of my office phone. I never broke eye contact with my father. I held his terrified gaze as I raised my other hand and pressed the speed dial button for my legal team. The line rang once, twice. My father watched my finger hovering over the speakerphone button, the realization of his own destruction finally beginning to dawn in his eyes. "David, it is Hannah," I said into the receiver. My voice was crisp, cutting through the heavy silence of my office. I kept my gaze locked on my father. His hands, previously planted with such dominance on my mahogany desk, began to tremble slightly. "Hannah, good morning," David replied. His voice was bright, the professional tone of a senior corporate attorney ready for the day. "I have the file you requested yesterday afternoon right in front of me. Are we proceeding?" "We are," I stated. I leaned forward, making sure my father could hear every single syllable clearly. "Execute the documents. I am officially withdrawing my personal guarantee on the Adams Family Trust, Logan's corporate accounts, and Brenda's platinum lines. I want the formal withdrawal notices submitted to Chase and Bank of America immediately." "Understood," David said, his tone shifting into absolute business mode. "Just to be perfectly clear for the record, Hannah pulling the guarantee at this juncture will violate the covenants of their current lending agreements. The banks will receive the notices within the hour. They will immediately freeze all associated credit lines and likely issue default notices by the end of the business day." "Are you authorizing this action?" "I am fully aware of the consequences, David," I replied, watching the last drop of blood drain from my father's face. "Let the accounts default. Do it now." "Consider it done. I will email you the confirmation receipts." I placed the receiver back onto its cradle. The click sounded like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. Thomas stood completely paralyzed. His mouth hung open, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps. The arrogant Boston patriarch, who had barged into my office just 10 minutes prior, had vanished. In his place stood a terrified, financially ruined old man. He looked at the phone, then at me, as if he could not process the sequence of events that had just destroyed his entire fabricated universe. "You cannot do this," he whispered. His voice was brittle, devoid of all its previous booming authority. "Hannah, you cannot do this. You are bluffing. You would not ruin your own flesh and blood." "I just did," I replied evenly. "And it was not a bluff. David is filing the paperwork as we speak. By lunchtime, Logan's corporate accounts will be locked. By dinner, Chase will initiate the default protocols. You built a house of cards on my credit score, Dad. I just pulled out the bottom card." "But the collateral," Thomas stammered, his eyes widening in sheer terror as the mathematical reality crashed down on him. "Hannah, the banks required cross-collateralization when we restructured Logan's debt 3 years ago. The investment firm is tied to the Adams Family Trust. The trust is tied to the estate." "Yes, it is," I agreed, folding my hands neatly on my desk. "Which means when Logan defaults on his commercial loans this afternoon, the bank will automatically trigger a claim against the trust. And since the trust is completely empty, because you and Mom drained it to fund your country club lifestyle, the bank will move to the next available asset." Thomas gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked like he was going to collapse. "The house," he choked out. "They will call the loans due immediately. They will foreclose on the mansion. That is standard banking procedure when a high-risk borrower loses their primary guarantor," I said, offering him a polite clinical smile. "You taught me everything I know about finance, Dad. You should have anticipated this." He stumbled backward, bumping into one of my guest chairs. The reality of his situation was suffocating him. He was a man who measured his entire worth by his zip code, his tailored suits, and the exclusive events he attended. Without my signature, he was absolutely nothing. He was broke. He was a fraud. And worse, he was about to be exposed to the entire city. "Please," Thomas begged. The words sounded foreign coming from his mouth. He held his hands out to me, his palms facing upward in a gesture of total desperation. "Hannah, please stop this. Call David back. Tell him you made a mistake. Tell him to cancel the filing. I will do whatever you want. I will make your mother apologize to Jake. I will force her to get on her hands and knees and beg his forgiveness. Just stop the withdrawal." I stared at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust. He was willing to sell out his wife in a heartbeat to save his own skin. He had no loyalty to anyone but his own ego. "An hour ago, you called my husband a trash collector," I reminded him, my voice dangerously low. You told me that I did not need social standing and that all the resources of this family belonged to Logan. You made your choice. You chose the golden child. Now Logan can fund your lifestyle. Logan has nothing. Thomas cried out, tears actually pooling in the corners of his eyes. You know he has nothing. His firm is hemorrhaging money. Whitney spends faster than he can borrow. If the bank forecloses, Logan will be utterly ruined in front of Whitney's powerful family. Her father will destroy us. Whitney will leave him. The political scandal will be on the front page of the Boston Globe. You are going to make us a laughingstock. Logan made himself a laughingstock the day he decided to play billionaire with my money, I said. And as for Whitney, her family's political prestige is no longer my concern. She should have thought about that before she mocked my husband's livelihood. Thomas fell to his knees. The great untouchable patriarch was literally kneeling on the carpet of my office weeping. Hannah, I am begging you. The charity gala is this weekend. Whitney's entire extended family is flying in from Washington. If our credit cards are frozen, if the venue cancels, we will be publicly humiliated. Please, have mercy on your family. I looked down at him. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no guilt. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for over 3 decades was completely dead. They had pushed me too far, and there was no coming back from the disrespect they had shown, the only man who truly loved me. I reached out and gently closed my laptop, the soft click of the machine signaling the end of the meeting. I stood up from my desk, looking down at the weeping shell of my father. I suggest you go home and start packing, Dad, I said, my voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. You are going to need a lot of cardboard boxes. Thomas left my office, a broken man stumbling toward the elevators as if the floor beneath him had suddenly turned to liquid. I did not watch him go. I returned to my quarterly reports, my focus absolute. The machinery of corporate finance is entirely devoid of emotion. It does not care about your zip code, your pedigree, or the prestigious last name your ancestors brought over on the Mayflower. It only cares about math. And by Wednesday morning, the math had finally caught up with my brother. The devastation was swifter than even I had anticipated. The moment my legal withdrawal hit the desks at Chase and Bank of America, red flags illuminated across their risk management systems. Logan had been running his boutique investment firm like a personal piggy bank. When the banks initiated their aggressive emergency audit, they did not just find a few missed payments, they stared into a financial black hole. Logan was millions of dollars in debt. He possessed zero liquid assets. Every single dollar of operating capital he claimed to have was actually just revolving credit backed by my signature. The auditors moved with ruthless efficiency. By 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, they locked the doors on his digital vaults. They froze his corporate accounts, his payroll accounts, and his personal checking. They canceled his company credit cards and instantly revoked his trading privileges. Logan went from pretending to be a master of the universe to being entirely insolvent in the span of a single coffee break. While Logan was sweating through his tailored suit in a boardroom surrounded by angry compliance officers, his wife was busy living in her manufactured reality. Whitney was downtown on Newbury Street, holding court at one of the most exclusive bridal and evening wear boutiques in New England. She was there to secure her custom dress for the upcoming charity gala. She had brought 3 of her high society friends along to witness her opulence. They were sipping complimentary champagne, sitting on velvet sofas, and praising Whitney for her impeccable taste. The gown she had selected was a breathtaking creation of imported silk and hand-sewn crystal beadwork. The price tag was a staggering $10,000. For Whitney, dropping 10 grand on a dress she would wear exactly once was simply the cost of doing business. It was how she maintained her dominance over the Boston social scene. She glided up to the marble checkout counter flanked by her entourage. She flashed her brilliant practice smile at the boutique manager and casually handed over her heavy metal platinum card. The manager ran the card through the reader. The machine beeped, a harsh, unpleasant sound. The manager frowned, apologizing profusely, and ran the card a second time. The machine beeped again. The screen flashed a bright red declined message. Whitney laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. She waved her hand dismissively. blaming a bank error, and retrieved a different card from her designer clutch. She handed over a gold corporate card tied to Logan's firm. The manager processed it, declined. The atmosphere in this boutique shifted instantly. The polite smiles of the staff became strained. The soft murmurs of Whitney's elite friends ceased altogether. They exchanged knowing sideways glances. In their world, a declined card was not a banking error. It was a social death sentence. It was the undeniable stench of insolvency. Whitney's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson. Her hands shook as she dug through her wallet, offering a third card, then a fourth. Every single piece of plastic was met with the exact same glaring red rejection. The boutique manager finally stepped back, offering a tight, pitying smile, and quietly suggested that perhaps Whitney should contact her financial institution. The absolute mortification shattered Whitney's perfect facade. She snatched her useless cards off the marble counter, grabbed her coat, and stormed out of the boutique, leaving her friends behind. The moment the glass doors closed behind her, she pulled out her phone and unleashed a torrent of unhinged fury upon Logan. She screamed at him right there on the sidewalk, demanding to know why her cards were bouncing and why she was being humiliated in front of the most powerful women in the city. She blamed him for making her look like a poverty-stricken fool. I knew none of these exact details as they happened, but the resulting shockwave hit my phone precisely at 2 o'clock that afternoon. My phone began vibrating on my desk with a violent, unending rhythm. It was Brenda. She had clearly just received the phone call from a hysterical Whitney and a terrified Logan. My mother realized that the financial apocalypse I promised on Monday was not a threat. It was an active, ongoing reality. She sent 42 text messages in the span of 15 minutes. I sat at my desk and watched them roll in one by one. I did not reply. I just read. Her messages were a masterclass in narcissistic rage. She started by commanding me to fix the glitch. When I did not answer, she quickly devolved into pure, unadulterated venom. She typed that I was a treacherous, ungrateful brat. She swore she would disown me permanently. She promised to call every hospital administrator and corporate executive in my professional network to tell them I was mentally unstable and financially abusive. She threatened to ruin my reputation in Boston so thoroughly that I would have to move out of the state to find work. She called Jake a disease that had infected my brain. She cursed the very day I was born. 42 messages of concentrated hatred from the woman who gave birth to me. A weaker version of myself might have cried. A younger version of myself might have felt a twinge of fear at the threat of public ruin. But the woman sitting in that corner office felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of vindication. They were finally showing their true colors, documented perfectly in black and white. I calmly picked up my phone. I selected the entire thread of Brenda's 42 furious text messages. I tapped the export button and quietly forwarded the complete conversation to a secure, encrypted cloud folder. I labeled the file Brenda Threats. In the corporate world, you always keep your receipts. When dealing with my family, those documented receipts were about to become my absolute ultimate armor against their lies. I set the phone face down on my pristine mahogany desk, completely and fully ready for whatever desperate, frantic move my family tried to make next against me. I had spent the remainder of Wednesday and the entirety of Thursday watching the financial slaughter from a comfortable distance. The storm I unleashed was localized entirely over my parents' estate and my brother's sham of an investment firm. I operated in absolute silence. I went to work, managed my teams, and returned home to my sanctuary. The frantic energy of my former family could not penetrate the walls of the life Jake and I had built together. It was Thursday evening. The sky outside my home office window had deepened into a rich, bruised purple, the final remnants of the winter sun fading behind the Boston skyline. I was sitting at my desk, the soft glow of my monitor illuminating the room, finalizing a logistics report for the hospital network. The house was blissfully quiet. Lily was upstairs, fast asleep after a long day of school and soccer practice. The ambient peace of my home was a stark, beautiful contrast to the absolute meltdown happening across the city. The heavy oak door to my office pushed open. Jake walked in. He had traded his heavy leather work boots for comfortable house slippers, but he still wore his faded denim jeans and a simple, well-worn Henley shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. The bruise on his cheek from my mother's hand had faded into a dull yellowish green, a lingering physical badge of their arrogance. He carried two heavy crystal tumblers filled with amber whiskey in one hand. In his other hand, he held a thick, tightly bound legal folder. He set one of the glasses down on my pristine desk right next to my keyboard. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. He took a slow sip from his own glass, his eyes scanning my face with that quiet, intense perception that had always made me feel completely seen and safe. He rounded the desk and leaned his hip against the edge of the mahogany surface, crossing his ankles comfortably. He asked how my day was. I took a sip of the smooth, burning liquid and told him it was highly productive and wonderfully quiet. He smiled, swirling the whiskey in his glass, listening to the ice rattle. He then mentioned, with the casual, breezy tone of someone discussing the upcoming weekend weather, that he had heard an interesting rumor downtown today. He heard that Logan was getting evicted from his prestigious corporate office space. I paused, setting my glass down on a coaster. I nodded, confirming the rumor. I explained that the bank had frozen Logan's operating capital because he had not paid his rent in 3 months. I admitted that I used to cover that deficit for him, quietly transferring funds every quarter so he would not be thrown out on the street and humiliated in front of his peers, but that arrangement was permanently terminated on Monday. Jake smiled. It was not his usual warm, comforting smile. It was the calculating, sharp, predatory grin of a man who had built a commercial empire from scratch with his bare hands and ruthless business acumen. He looked down at me and stated that Logan actually had not paid his full rent in 3 years. I frowned, leaning back in my chair. I asked him what he meant by that. I knew Logan's finances intimately because I had been the one guaranteeing them. I knew exactly what his commercial lease agreements looked like and exactly how much he owed every month. Jake tapped the heavy legal folder he had brought into the room. He spoke with a quiet, lethal calm. He said my family had always been so incredibly obsessed with his background. They were so eager to call him trailer trash, so eager to mock his clothing, and so quick to belittle his intelligence that they never actually bothered to look up the legal name of his parent company. They saw a man in a hard hat, assumed he was nothing more than a day laborer, and completely stopped their research right there. Jake tossed the thick folder onto my desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed in the quiet room. He told me to open it. I reached out and flipped open the thick cardboard cover. Inside were stacks of official property deeds, commercial lease agreements, and corporate tax records. At the very top of every single page, printed in bold, embossed lettering, was the corporate logo for J&H Holdings. I stared at the letters. J&H, Jake, and Hannah. I looked up at my husband, my mind racing at light speed to connect the dots. Jake softly explained that J&H Holdings owned the luxury commercial high-rise located squarely in the financial district. The exact high-rise where Logan leased his supposedly prestigious investment firm office. He watched my eyes widen in absolute disbelief. Then he added another devastating piece of information. He stated that J&H Holdings also happened to own the historic downtown ballroom. The exact highly coveted ballroom where my mother Brenda was desperately trying to host her elite New Year charity gala this coming weekend. I was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the revelation. I looked back down at the lease agreements in the folder. I saw Logan's arrogant signature at the bottom of the pages, completely unaware of who held the actual deed to his professional kingdom. Jake continued, his voice darkening with a fierce, protective intensity. He told me that 3 years ago, when I had broken down crying in our kitchen, because my family was struggling and Logan was facing ruin, he had taken action. He saw the toll their financial incompetence was taking on my mental health. So he quietly instructed his property management team to aggressively subsidize Logan's office rent by 80%. He had also manually waived the massive security deposit and the exorbitant venue fees for my mother's upcoming gala. He did it entirely from the shadows. He did it because he loved me, and he did not want to watch me stress myself to an early grave trying to keep them from drowning. He leaned his powerful frame over my desk, placing his large, calloused hands flat over the legal documents, the very hands my mother had deemed unworthy of her dining room table. He looked me dead in the eye. He said that was the past. He said that he was willing to carry their financial weight when they were just foolish and incompetent. But after what my mother did to him on Christmas, after she laid her hands on him in front of our daughter, after the vile, unforgivable things they texted me earlier in the week, Jake stated that the generous subsidies were officially over. He stood up straight, his presence dominating the room. He reached into the back of the folder and pulled out two crisp, freshly printed legal documents with bright red headers. He laid them gently on top of my laptop keyboard. They were formal eviction notices, one for Logan's corporate office suite, one for the historic ballroom venue. Jake picked up his whiskey glass, holding it up in a silent, menacing toast. He looked at me with a gaze that promised absolute ruin for anyone who crossed us. He smiled and said he thought it was time we collect our rent, Mrs. Adams. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating wait for the people who shared my last name. Completely unaware that Jake and I were holding the deed to their entire social existence, Brenda and Logan scrambled in absolute panic to save face. The financial drought I had initiated on Monday had now evolved into a completely barren wasteland. Logan sat in his supposedly prestigious corner office, staring at computer screens that displayed nothing but frozen accounts and zero balances. The walls were rapidly closing in on him. His desk phone rang constantly. It was Brenda. Her voice bordered on hysteria. She demanded to know if the funds had been secured. She shrieked that the luxury catering company was threatening to pull their entire staff if a wire transfer of $75,000 was not completed by noon. The florists were actively packing their imported orchids back into their delivery trucks. The string quartet was demanding their retainer in cash. Brenda warned Logan that if the charity gala was canceled, Whitney's powerful political family would discover they were completely broke, and the ensuing scandal would destroy them all. Logan was sweating through his custom-tailored shirt. He had no safety net. He could not call me. He could not leverage my pristine credit score anymore. Desperation drove him to make the most catastrophic business decision of his entirely fabricated career. He left his commercial building and drove to a notoriously discreet part of the city. He walked into a dimly lit private cigar lounge to meet a man who specialized in alternative lending. It was a polite term for a predatory loan shark. Logan sat across from a man who did not care about social standing or country club memberships. This man only cared about crippling interest rates and brutal collateral. Logan was so desperate to cover the catering and basic gala expenses that he blindly signed a short-term bridge loan with an astronomical predatory interest rate. He put up the remaining heavily leveraged assets of his failing investment firm as collateral. He effectively signed away his soul just to secure a wire transfer to keep the caterers from walking out. Logan walked out of that cigar lounge clutching a cashier's check, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He exhaled a massive sigh of relief. He genuinely believed he had saved the day. He thought he had outsmarted the crisis. He believed the gala would proceed flawlessly. His elite image would remain untarnished, and he could figure out how to pay back the loan shark next week. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was digging his financial grave so deep that he would never see daylight again. While Logan was busy selling his future to unregulated lenders, his wife was busy broadcasting their arrogance to the entire world. In the master suite of their luxury penthouse, Whitney was completely oblivious to the impending doom. She sat in front of a professional lighting rig, getting her makeup touched up by a hired artist. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, a piece of jewelry that Logan had purchased on a credit line that was now violently overdrawn. She picked up her phone and hit record on her social media application. Whitney smiled brilliantly into the camera, addressing her tens of thousands of followers. Her voice dripped with the unearned superiority of a woman who believed the world existed simply to serve her. She boasted enthusiastically about the charity gala scheduled for tomorrow night. She deliberately name-dropped the prominent East Coast senators and governors from her Black African-American political family who would be in attendance. She bragged about the exclusive guest list, the imported champagne, and the sheer prestige of the event. Most ironically, she spent a full minute praising the venue. She told her followers about the unmatched opulence of the historic downtown ballroom. She called it the crown jewel of Boston real estate. She urged every single local media outlet and society photographer to be present, promising them the most extravagant, flawless event of the century. Whitney thought she was cementing her status as the queen of Boston high society. In reality, she was inadvertently drawing maximum public attention to her own upcoming execution. She was personally inviting the entire city to watch the exact moment her fake empire crumbled. She was ensuring that when Jake and I finally dropped the hammer, the audience would be massive, captive, and completely unforgiving. Back at the commercial high-rise, the clock struck 5:15 in the afternoon. Logan was rushing around his corner office, throwing documents into his leather briefcase. He had secured the shady funds, the caterers were paid, the crisis was supposedly averted. He just needed to leave the office, meet Whitney for an expensive pre-gala dinner, and pretend everything was perfectly fine. Down in the reception area, the elevator doors slid open. A courier stepped out holding a thick, rigid white envelope. The envelope bore a bright red official legal stamp. The return address printed neatly in the top corner simply read J&H Holdings. The courier approached the reception desk and handed the envelope to Logan's assistant. He stated it was an urgent certified legal delivery, requiring an immediate signature. The assistant quickly signed the electronic pad, took the heavy envelope, and walked briskly toward Logan's office. She caught him just as he was shrugging into his tailored wool overcoat, his hand already reaching for the brass doorknob. She held out the sealed envelope, informing him that an urgent legal notice had just arrived by courier. Logan glanced at the thick white paper. His mind was entirely focused on his dinner reservations and the massive predatory loan he had just signed. He did not recognize the name J&H Holdings. To him, it was just another piece of corporate mail, perhaps a routine building notice or a boring compliance update. He had survived the day. He had no capacity left for administrative paperwork. He waved his hand dismissively at his assistant. He told her to leave it on his desk. He stated confidently that whatever it was, it could wait. He said he would read it on Monday morning. Logan walked out of his office completely unaware that he had just left a 72-hour notice to vacate, sitting unopened on his mahogany desk. He stepped into the elevator with a satisfied, arrogant smile, entirely blind to the fact that the clock was already ticking down to his absolute destruction. The biting winter wind whipped through the historic streets of Boston as Friday afternoon settled over the city. I stood quietly on the brick-paved sidewalk outside the wrought iron gates of my daughter's prestigious private elementary school. The pickup line was a parade of luxury sport utility vehicles idling along the curb. Parents wrapped in expensive cashmere coats, huddled together sipping artisanal coffees. I had taken a rare half-day away from the healthcare corporate office. After the intense financial executions I had orchestrated throughout the week, I wanted nothing more than to surprise Lily and take her to her favorite bakery for hot chocolate. My mind was clear, and the suffocating weight of my family's fabricated elite lifestyle was finally off my shoulders. That fleeting peace was violently shattered by the roaring engine of a high-performance sports car. A blindingly white Porsche Cayenne swerved dangerously into the designated school loading zone. Its heavy tires shrieked against the freezing asphalt as it jerked to a halt, parking completely illegally across the pedestrian crosswalk. The chaotic maneuver forced a crossing guard to jump back and drew immediate glares from the waiting parents. The driver's side door flew open. Whitney stepped out onto the pavement. My sister-in-law looked as though she had just stepped off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. She wore a flawlessly tailored camel wool coat, knee-high Italian leather boots, and oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her meticulously styled hair. But the elegant illusion she projected was instantly destroyed by the expression of pure fury twisting her features. She slammed the heavy car door and marched directly toward me, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the concrete sidewalk. I did not take a single step back. I kept my hands casually tucked into the warm pockets of my coat. I watched her approach with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a highly volatile experiment. Whitney stopped just inches from my face, invading my personal space with hostile intent. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and hissed that I had exactly 5 minutes to pull out my phone and restore Logan's banking access. She demanded that I fix the frozen credit lines immediately. She spat that her powerful, politically connected parents were arriving in the city tomorrow morning for the charity gala, and she absolutely refused to be embarrassed by a banking glitch caused by a petty sister-in-law. I looked at her, my expression completely blank. I politely informed her that she was wasting her breath. I stated clearly that my financial involvement with her husband was permanently terminated and there was no glitch to fix. Whitney scoffed. It was a harsh, ugly sound that clashed entirely with her aristocratic upbringing. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and leaned closer, dropping her voice to a menacing whisper. She stated that her father was a highly influential political figure, and her uncles held massive leverage on the executive boards of the most powerful hospital networks in the country. She threatened me directly. She swore that if I did not authorize the funds right then and there, she would launch a relentless, highly publicized smear campaign against my professional career. She vowed to have me fired from my position as director of operations before the end of the month. She threatened to have me blacklisted from every major healthcare group in the nation. She sneered that she would paint me in the media as a corrupt, incompetent executive who stole from her own family to fund a trashy lifestyle with a garbage contractor husband. She genuinely believed she was holding a loaded gun to my head. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of fear. I simply smiled at her. It was a slow, pitying smile that made her eyes narrow in sudden confusion. I asked her if she truly believed that political power could stop an active federal bank investigation. Whitney froze instantly. The vicious threat died right in her throat. The color drained from her cheeks as she demanded to know what I was talking about. I kept my voice perfectly calm and conversational. I politely informed Whitney that political clout meant absolutely nothing when her husband was actively being investigated by major financial institutions for severe corporate fraud, gross financial negligence, and total insolvency. I explained that Logan had been running his boutique investment firm as a fraudulent shell game for 3 long years. I told her that he possessed zero liquid assets, was millions of dollars in debt to commercial lenders, and had likely been burning through predatory street loans just to keep the caterers from walking out on her precious gala. I watched her eyes widen in shock as I delivered the final blow. I explained that the only reason she had been able to afford that white Porsche, her luxury penthouse, and her opulent country club dinners was because my signature had been artificially inflating their credit lines. I advised her that instead of threatening my career, she should call her powerful father right now and beg him for a massive cash loan because by Monday morning she was going to be completely destitute. Whitney vehemently refused to accept it. Her fragile pride would not allow her to process the fact that she had married a financial fraud. She stepped back, her face twisting with blind rage. She shouted that I was nothing but a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin her happiness. She threw one last desperate insult, declaring that I would spend the rest of my life rotting in mediocrity while she ruled Boston society. She turned on her heel, marching furiously back to the illegally parked Porsche. She threw herself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, the tires squealing wildly against the asphalt as she sped away from the curb, desperate to outrun the humiliating truth. I watched the stark white vehicle disappear down the busy street just as the school bell finally rang. Children began pouring out of the heavy double doors, their laughter filling the courtyard. Before I could step forward to greet Lily, my cell phone vibrated deep in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. Because I had been the primary financial guarantor on all of Logan's assets for the past 3 years, my contact information was still linked as an emergency notification contact on several of his automated corporate accounts. The notification on my screen was an urgent alert from a high-end automotive financing company. I read the crisp clinical text. The scheduled monthly lease payment for the Porsche Cayenne registered to Logan and Whitney had just violently bounced due to insufficient funds and a frozen banking profile. The standard grace period had been automatically bypassed due to the sheer volume of negative financial flags destroying the account. The final sentence of the alert was the absolute perfect conclusion to the afternoon. The vehicle's status had just been officially updated in the system. The asset recovery team had been dispatched. The pristine white Porsche that Whitney had just sped away in was now flagged for immediate involuntary repossession. Saturday evening descended on Boston with a biting icy chill, but inside the historic downtown ballroom the temperature was perfectly regulated to accommodate the bare shoulders of the city elite. The venue was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles cast a warm, flattering glow over the intricate crown molding and the polished marble floors. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar and flutes of vintage champagne. This was the absolute epicenter of Boston high society, and tonight my family was pretending to own it. Brenda held court near the grand entrance, draped in a floor-length gown of sapphire velvet. To the untrained eye, she looked like the undisputed matriarch of a wealthy, untouchable dynasty. She laughed loudly, placing a manicured hand on the arm of a state senator, projecting the absolute illusion of unlimited capital. Thomas stood dutifully beside her, wearing a rented tuxedo he had secured just days prior after his personal tailor declined his frozen credit card. He gripped his scotch glass tightly, his knuckles stark white, forcing a hearty laugh at political jokes he barely heard. He was playing the role of the relaxed patriarch, but the beads of sweat gathering at his temples betrayed the sheer panic coursing through his veins. He knew the financial guillotine was swinging down toward his neck, yet he stood there smiling for the cameras. Across the room, Logan and Whitney were aggressively networking with Whitney's powerful East Coast relatives. Whitney had somehow managed to procure a replacement designer dress, likely charging it to one of her father's political accounts after the humiliating rejection at the boutique. She smiled brilliantly for the society photographers, tossing her perfect hair and pointing out the opulent floral arrangements that Logan had funded using predatory street loans. She had conveniently omitted the minor detail that she had been forced to arrive at the gala in a hired car, because her pristine white Porsche had been forcibly repossessed from the elementary school parking lot just 24 hours earlier. Logan's smile was incredibly brittle. He was shaking hands with hedge fund managers and political heavyweights, desperately hoping none of them had heard the whispers of his total insolvency currently circulating through the financial district. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the fact that the icy water was already rushing in to drown them. While my family was busy performing their desperate pantomime of wealth across town, the atmosphere inside my own home was entirely different. There was no panic. There was no frantic scrambling to cover bounced checks or appease angry loan sharks. There was only the quiet, steady hum of absolute certainty. Downstairs, Lily was happily watching an animated movie with our trusted nanny, completely shielded from the toxic warfare her grandparents had initiated. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in our master bedroom. I was not dressing to impress anyone. I was dressing for a professional execution. I slipped into a custom-tailored emerald green gown. The heavy silk fabric fell flawlessly against my skin, the rich color mirroring the cold, calculating energy that had taken root in my chest. I clasped a simple diamond necklace around my throat. It was not rented. It was not purchased on a fraudulent credit line. It was a gift from my husband, bought and paid for with the legitimate proceeds of his massive commercial empire. I turned as the bedroom door opened. Jake walked in, and the sheer presence of the man commanded the entire room. He had traded his denim and work boots for a bespoke jet-black Tom Ford tuxedo. The sharp, precise tailoring accentuated his broad shoulders and the rugged strength he had built from years of relentless physical and mental labor. The faint remnants of the bruise on his cheek from my mother's hand only added to the lethal, uncompromising aura he projected. He looked exactly like a man who could buy and sell my father 10 times over before breakfast, which mathematically speaking he absolutely could. He stopped behind me, resting his large hands on my bare shoulders. We looked at our reflection in the glass. We did not look like the scapegoat daughter and the trailer trash contractor. We looked like the apex predators of the Boston real estate market. We were not attending this charity gala as guests hoping to gain favor with the political elite. We were attending as the undisputed owners of the building, the architects of my family's financial destruction, and the ultimate authorities on who was allowed to stand in that historic ballroom. Jake leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to the curve of my neck. He pulled back and reached into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket. He produced a crisp, thick white envelope. The heavy paper bore the official red legal seal of our corporate attorneys. It was identical to the one Logan had carelessly left unopened on his office desk the day before. I looked at the envelope, knowing exactly what was inside. It was the final, unassailable legal notice. It was the formal declaration that my parents' heavily leveraged mansion had been successfully cross-collateralized against Logan's defaulted commercial debt. It was the absolute proof that the sprawling estate they used to project their fake elite status now legally belonged to the company Jake and I had built from the ground up. The crisp white envelope felt heavy in my hands. It held the culmination of 34 years of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and blatant disrespect. It held the keys to my childhood home, a home that had never felt like a sanctuary, but rather a prison of impossible expectations. Jake handed the envelope to me. He stepped back, adjusting his silk bow tie with a calm, deliberate motion. The corners of his mouth lifted into a sharp, dangerous smile that promised absolute ruin for the people who had dared to disrespect us. "Ready to crash a party?" he asked. "I was born ready," I replied, slipping the crisp white envelope into my emerald clutch. I took my husband's offered arm, and we walked out of our sanctuary and into the freezing Boston night. The drive to the historic downtown ballroom took less than 20 minutes, but the anticipation in the car was electric. Jake drove his sleek black sedan with effortless precision, the streetlights reflecting off the polished hood. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the venue, completely bypassing the chaotic valet line where chauffeurs were scrambling to park the luxury vehicles of my family's guests. Jake simply parked the car in the private designated owner space right beside the main doors, a space Brenda had undoubtedly assumed was reserved for a prominent politician or a major donor. We stepped out into the biting winter wind and walked up the sweeping marble steps. Two liveried attendants pulled open the massive ornate brass doors. We stepped into the grand foyer of the historic ballroom. The sheer visual impact of the architecture was stunning, but the shift in the atmosphere the moment we crossed the threshold was even more dramatic. The foyer was packed with the absolute upper crust of Boston high society. State senators, wealthy philanthropists, and East Coast political heavyweights stood in tight, exclusive circles, sipping vintage champagne and exchanging polite laughter. Jake and I did not hover near the coat check. We did not wait to be escorted. We walked directly into the center of the room with the unhurried, dominant stride of people who owned the very floor beneath their feet. Heads began to turn. Conversations faltered. The visual contrast we presented was impossible to ignore. In a room full of rented tuxedos and desperate social climbers clinging to their status, Jake and I radiated genuine, unbothered power. My emerald gown caught the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above, and Jake looked absolutely lethal in his bespoke suit. We did not look like the estranged daughter and the blue-collar outcast. We looked like a threat. It took exactly 30 seconds for my mother to spot us. Brenda was standing near a towering ice sculpture holding a delicate flute of champagne and laughing a high artificial laugh at a joke told by a local judge. I watched her gaze casually sweep the room and suddenly lock onto my face. The transformation was instantaneous and ugly. Her perfect diplomatic smile vanished, completely collapsing into a twisted scowl of pure, unfiltered hatred. She shoved her champagne glass into the hands of a passing waiter, nearly spilling the expensive liquid over his tray. She marched across the polished marble floor, her heavy sapphire velvet gown swishing aggressively with every furious step. Whitney was right behind her, trailing like a poisonous shadow. My sister-in-law wore a look of smug, vicious anticipation, clearly thrilled at the prospect of watching me be publicly humiliated. Brenda stopped mere inches from me, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically around to ensure the surrounding elites were not eavesdropping on her impending meltdown. "What the hell are you doing here?" Brenda hissed. The venom in her voice was thick and desperate. "I told you that you were dead to me. I told you to never show your face around this family again." I looked at her calmly, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. Brenda did not wait for an answer. Her furious gaze shifted from me to Jake. Her upper lip curled in profound disgust, viewing him as a repulsive stain on her perfect evening. "And you brought him," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You actually had the audacity to bring this piece of garbage to my gala. I will not have this trailer trash breathing the same air as Whitney's family. You are going to ruin everything Logan has worked for." "Logan has worked for nothing," I replied, my voice cool and perfectly level. "And we do not need an invitation to be here, Brenda." Whitney stepped out from behind my mother, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You are completely delusional, Hannah," she sneered, her voice dripping with aristocratic arrogance. "This is a private ticketed event for the highest tier of society, not a soup kitchen. You cannot just walk in here and pretend you belong. Leave quietly or we will have you physically removed." Brenda did not waste another second. Her eyes scanned the perimeter of the grand foyer, locking onto the venue's security detail. "Security!" Brenda commanded, raising her hand and snapping her fingers with sharp, entitled authority. "Security, get over here immediately!" Across the foyer, two massive, imposing security guards in sharp black suits broke away from their posts near the ballroom entrance. They were broad-shouldered, serious men, equipped with earpieces and an air of absolute professionalism. They moved swiftly through the crowd of startled guests, heading directly toward our escalating confrontation. Brenda turned back to me, a triumphant, malicious gleam in her eyes. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought she was about to orchestrate the ultimate public humiliation, watching the daughter who defied her, and the contractor who insulted her, get dragged out into the freezing snow by their collars. "Throw this trailer trash out!" Brenda ordered the approaching guards, pointing a shaking finger directly at Jake's chest. "They are trespassing. They are not on the guest list. Remove them from my event right this second." Whitney smirked, shifting her weight and waiting for the spectacle to unfold. The two large security guards stopped squarely in front of us. They stood practically shoulder to shoulder, towering over my mother and my sister-in-law. Brenda took a step back, gesturing frantically for them to grab my husband. The guards did not reach for Jake. They did not ask to see our invitations. They did not even look at Brenda or Whitney. Instead, both men stood perfectly straight, clasped their hands respectfully in front of them, and dipped their heads in a synchronized, deferential nod directed entirely at the man standing by my side. "Good evening, Mr. Boss," the head of security said, his deep voice carrying clearly over the hushed whispers of the surrounding crowd. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The head of security did not blink. He did not look at my mother. His unwavering respect was directed entirely at my husband. Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked from the towering guards to Jake, her brain violently rejecting the reality unfolding right in front of her. The men she had ordered to act as her personal bouncers had just bowed to the man she considered dirt beneath her shoes. Whitney, however, broke the silence with a harsh, abrasive scoff. She rolled her eyes, her aristocratic facade cracking under the pressure of her own confusion and arrogance. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her diamond bracelets clinking together with a sharp, frantic sound. She looked at the security team with utter disdain and asked if these men were Jake's drinking buddies from the construction site. She demanded to know if he had bribed the venue staff to put on this ridiculous performance just to embarrass her family. She sneered that hiring cheap muscle to play pretend was exactly the kind of pathetic, low-class stunt a trash collector would pull to make himself feel important. I did not look at Whitney when I answered. I took a deliberate, measured step forward, closing the physical distance between myself and my mother. I stepped directly into Brenda's personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back slightly to meet my gaze. The scent of her expensive imported perfume was suffocating, but I did not flinch. I kept my voice perfectly calm, projecting it just loud enough for the surrounding circle of Boston elites to hear every single syllable. I said, "Actually, Whitney, they are not his drinking buddies. They are employees of J&H Holdings." I paused, letting the name of the company hang in the dead air between us. I watched Brenda's eyes dart back and forth as her mind desperately tried to process the acronym. J and H, Jake and Hannah. J&H Holdings. I repeated, my voice cutting like ice through the warm foyer. The company that owns this building. The company that owns the commercial high-rise where your husband leases his office. The company that owns the very ground you are currently standing on. The color drained from Whitney's face in a rapid, terrifying rush. Her arms uncrossed, falling limply to her sides as if the invisible strings holding her up had just been severed. She stared at me, her mouth parting in a silent gasp. The sheer magnitude of the information was short-circuiting her brain. She looked at Jake, taking in the bespoke tuxedo, the unbothered posture, the absolute authority he commanded without uttering a single word. She finally saw what she had been too blind and prejudiced to see on Christmas Day. He was not a day laborer, he was a corporate titan. Brenda looked as though the polished marble floor had just dropped out from beneath her velvet heels. She reached out blindly, grabbing the edge of a tall draped cocktail table to steady herself. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark fabric. She whispered my name, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of terror and absolute disbelief. She stammered that this was impossible. She insisted that Logan was the successful one, that Logan had the massive corporate accounts, that Logan was the financial future of the Addams family. I leaned in closer to my mother. I lowered my voice to a lethal quiet register, ensuring only she could hear the final nail being driven into the coffin of her delusions. I told her that Logan had absolutely nothing. I explained that for the past 3 years my husband had been secretly subsidizing 80% of her golden boy's office rent. I revealed that Jake had manually waived the massive security deposit and the exorbitant venue fees for this exact charity gala simply because he loved me and did not want to see my family face total financial ruin. I watched the pure, unadulterated horror dawn in Brenda's eyes. The realization hit her physical frame like a freight train. The man she had slapped, the man she had called trailer trash in front of her granddaughter, had been the invisible benefactor keeping her entire high society lifestyle from collapsing into dust. She had viciously bitten the only hand that fed her, and now she was going to starve. I stepped back, breaking the suffocating proximity. I smoothed the front of my emerald gown, my posture perfectly straight and unyielding. The surrounding crowd of politicians, hedge fund managers, and socialites were staring at us in stunned fascination. The whispers had already begun to ripple through the grand foyer, carrying the undeniable intoxicating scent of high society scandal. Whitney tried to speak. She opened her mouth, her voice shaking uncontrollably as she demanded to know if this was some kind of elaborate sick joke. She insisted that her powerful father would never have allowed her to marry into a family that did not possess legitimate liquid capital. She looked wildly around the room, searching the crowd for her political parents, suddenly realizing that the elite dynasty she so proudly flaunted was about to be tied to a colossal, humiliating financial fraud. I did not offer Whitney a response. I did not owe her an explanation or a soft landing. She had made her choices when she sat at my dining table and mocked the man who was secretly keeping a roof over her head. I turned my back on both of them. I left my mother clutching the cocktail table, gasping for air, as her manufactured reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I left my sister-in-law staring into the void, calculating the impending violent destruction of her social standing. I did not wait for Jake to offer his arm. I walked with immediate purpose and absolute authority. The crowd of wealthy elites naturally parted for me, stepping aside as if reacting to an invisible magnetic force. They sensed the massive shift in power. They recognized who truly controlled the room. I bypassed the crowded coat check, ignored the bewildered stares of the state senators, and walked straight past the massive glittering ice sculpture that Brenda had meticulously selected to impress her guests. My destination was entirely clear. The grand ballroom was just ahead, the heavy mahogany doors propped wide open to welcome the city's finest. I stepped into the vast, glittering expanse of the main room. The jazz band was playing a lively, upbeat tune on the elevated stage, their brass instruments gleaming brightly under the massive crystal chandeliers. I walked straight down the center aisle, my eyes fixed entirely on the microphone standing in the center of the stage. The time for private conversations and quiet financial maneuvers was officially over. It was time to make a very public announcement. I moved through the sea of silk and tuxedo jackets with measured precision. The scent of expensive cologne and roasted duck hung heavy in the air. Guests parted instinctively as I approached the elevated platform. The jazz quintet was in the middle of a vibrant, brassy number. The trumpet player closed his eyes, swaying to the rhythm, completely unaware that the atmosphere in the room was about to undergo a violent, irreversible shift. I ascended the three carpeted steps on the left side of the stage. The heavy fabric of my emerald gown brushed softly against the wooden floorboards. I did not rush. I walked directly into the center of the spotlight, stepping right in front of the lead singer. She lowered her microphone, offering me a look of mild confusion, perhaps assuming I was a drunken guest or a scheduled speaker she had not been warned about. I reached out and gently but firmly took the chrome microphone from the heavy iron stand. The solid weight of the metal felt grounding in my palm. I looked out over the vast, glittering expanse of the ballroom. From this vantage point, the sheer scale of my family's financial delusion was breathtaking. There were at least 300 people in attendance. The tables were draped in fine European linens. Massive centerpieces of imported white orchids towered over the silver cutlery. Every single detail had been purchased on credit lines backed by my signature, and every single person in the room believed they were witnessing the triumph of the Addams family legacy. I raised my free hand and tapped the top of the microphone twice with my index finger. A sharp, piercing feedback whine erupted from the massive speakers mounted near the ceiling. The high-pitched frequency sliced through the lively jazz music like a razor blade. The trumpet player flinched, pulling his instrument away from his lips. The drummer missed a beat and abruptly stopped. The agonizing sound echoed across the grand ballroom, instantly demanding absolute attention. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Hundreds of conversations died in the span of a single second. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. The polite aristocratic laughter evaporated into the cold, conditioned air. 300 faces turned simultaneously toward the stage, their expressions shifting from mild annoyance to captivated curiosity. I stood perfectly still under the blinding glare of the spotlight. I scanned the sea of faces, absorbing the quiet, intoxicating power of holding the absolute attention of Boston's highest social echelon. My eyes swept over the front tables designated for the most critical VIP guests. I immediately spotted Whitney's parents. Her father, a prominent state senator with decades of political influence, sat straight-backed and stern, wearing a tailored tuxedo with a silk pocket square. Beside him sat her mother, a woman who practically radiated old money prestige dripping in generational diamonds. They were staring at me with polite expectation, completely oblivious to the fact that the man their daughter had married was entirely insolvent. They thought they were about to hear a heartwarming speech from a family member. They believed they were about to witness a toast to charity, to wealth, and to the union of two powerful dynasties. They had no idea they were sitting in the front row of an execution. My gaze shifted past the political elite and found my family standing near the rear entrance of the ballroom. They had finally managed to follow me inside. The tableau they presented was almost tragic. Logan was visibly trembling. His expensive suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He was staring at the large projection screen behind me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic, silently begging me not to do what he knew I was about to do. He knew the financial guillotine was suspended directly over his neck, and he was completely powerless to stop the blade from dropping. Brenda looked as though all the blood in her body had suddenly rushed to her feet. She was leaning heavily against a marble pillar, clutching her chest with one hand and covering her mouth with the other. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to have lost its luster. She was shaking her head in a desperate, silent plea. She looked exactly like a woman who is about to faint from the sheer crushing weight of public humiliation. She had spent her entire life carefully curating this exact moment, building an illusion of unmatched wealth and status. Now she was forced to watch her scapegoat daughter stand on her stage, holding the microphone, preparing to detonate a nuclear bomb in the center of her carefully constructed universe. Whitney stood beside her mother-in-law, no longer the arrogant, sneering woman from the parking lot. She looked small, terrified, and utterly confused. She glanced at her powerful parents at the front table, then back at me, the terrifying reality of her situation finally beginning to pierce through her thick layer of denial. I looked away from them. They no longer held any power over me. I looked out at the massive, silent crowd of politicians, hedge fund managers, and socialites. The silence in the ballroom was so profound that I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the wall clock near the kitchen doors. Every eye was locked on me. Every ear was waiting for my voice. I raised the microphone to my lips. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute certainty of my victory settle into my bones. My voice, when I finally spoke, did not tremble. It did not waver. It resonated through the state-of-the-art sound system, clear, cold, and echoing with unassailable authority. The amplified words washed over the pristine tables and bounced off the gilded molding of the walls. A low collective murmur began to ripple through the audience. Wealthy guests leaned toward one another, whispering in hushed, confused tones. The name of the holding company was clearly unfamiliar to them, but the assertion of ownership was unmistakable. The state senator at the front table narrowed his eyes, leaning forward in his chair with sudden, sharp interest. He was a man who understood the fundamental power dynamics of real estate, and he instantly recognized that the narrative he had been sold by his son-in-law was fundamentally flawed. I remained anchored in the center of the stage, allowing the monumental weight of my introduction to fully settle over the room. I glanced toward the side of the stage where Jake had quietly positioned himself. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his posture relaxed but incredibly vigilant. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, ensuring no one attempted to interrupt the proceedings. He gave me a single approving nod. The stage was entirely mine. The crowd was completely captive. The long, agonizing wait was finally over, and the truth was about to be unleashed. "Good evening, everyone," my voice echoed clearly. As the co-owner of J&H Holdings, the parent company of this property, it is always a pleasure to host Boston's finest. The words rippled through the grand ballroom with the force of a tidal wave. I watched the initial shock wash over the faces of the political elite seated at the front tables. State senators and wealthy hedge fund managers exchanged bewildered, frantic glances. The name of the holding company was entirely foreign to them, but the sheer, unyielding authority in my voice was undeniable. These people were accustomed to attending luxurious charity events hosted by old money families, not being ambushed by corporate landlords taking over the stage. I gestured gracefully to the side of the wooden platform. My husband stepped out from the shadows and walked directly into the blinding spotlight right beside me. The bespoke black tuxedo moved flawlessly with his athletic frame. He did not wave to the audience or offer a polite, accommodating smile. He simply stood there, a towering monument of self-made power, looking out over the sea of borrowed wealth with absolute indifference. I raised the microphone again. I introduced the captive crowd to my husband Jake. I explicitly stated that he was the J&H Holdings, the self-made founder of the commercial real estate empire that owned the very marble floor they were currently standing on. The reaction from the rear of the room was physical and violent. Whitney had been clutching a fresh flute of vintage champagne, desperately trying to maintain her aristocratic composure amidst her growing panic. When I uttered my husband's name and legally claimed ownership of the building, her long manicured fingers simply gave out. The fragile crystal slipped from her grasp and plummeted toward the polished stone floor. The impact produced a sharp, violently loud crash that echoed throughout the dead-silent ballroom. Shards of expensive crystal exploded outward, scattering aggressively across the floorboards. The pale golden liquid splashed over the heavy hem of her designer gown and splattered onto the pristine leather shoes of the wealthy guests standing nearby. Whitney did not even flinch at the mess she had just created. She stood completely paralyzed, her mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of absolute shock. Her eyes darted from my face to Jake's face, her aristocratic brain violently short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible. The man she had viciously ridiculed as a day laborer just hours ago was standing on a stage flanked by elite security, holding the deed to her entire social existence. At the front VIP table, Whitney's powerful parents reacted instantly to the sound of the shattering glass. Her father, the esteemed state senator, turned his head sharply. He looked at his daughter standing in a puddle of champagne, then looked back at me on the elevated stage. His thick gray eyebrows drew together in a hard, calculating frown. He was a veteran politician. He recognized a public execution when he saw one, and he suddenly realized his own family was dangerously close to the blast radius. I kept my gaze fixed on the audience, entirely refusing to look at my mother or my brother. I commanded the massive room with absolute unyielding precision. I told the gathered crowd that I wanted to personally welcome them to the venue tonight. I explained that it was a rare occasion for the building ownership to interrupt a scheduled charity event, but I stated that this particular evening required a very special exception. I tightened my grip on the cool metal of the microphone. I let my voice echo across the vast, silent room. I announced to the politicians, the socialites, and the media photographers that the supposed hosts of this evening's magnificent gala were unfortunately unable to fulfill their financial obligations. I stated clearly and clinically that my mother Brenda and my brother Logan were currently undergoing a severe financial restructuring. The phrase dropped into the room like a heavy stone plunging into a still pond. Severe financial restructuring. In the ruthless corporate world, those three words were a polite, sanitized translation for total catastrophic bankruptcy. A collective gasp erupted from the front tables. The aristocratic facade of the gala shattered instantly. Wealthy guests leaned toward one another, whispering frantically. Socialites covered their mouths in genuine shock. Politicians subtly pushed their chairs back, creating physical distance between themselves and the impending scandal. The long-standing illusion of the Addams family legacy was evaporating in real time. Logan looked like he was going to vomit. He grabbed the edge of a catering table, his knuckles turning stark white, his breathing shallow and incredibly rapid. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging me to stop. He knew his wealthy father-in-law was sitting just 20 feet away, absorbing every single word of my broadcast. Brenda was completely incapacitated. She leaned heavily against a marble pillar, covering her face with both hands, unable to hide from the blinding spotlight of public humiliation. She had spent decades crafting a narrative of elite superiority, stepping on anyone who got in her way, and now she was being publicly exposed as an absolute fraud by the very daughter she had deemed worthless. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not soften my tone or offer any comforting platitudes. They had built their entire kingdom on lies, and I was simply delivering the truth. I turned my body slightly, directing my attention to the rear of the grand ballroom. High above the main entrance, sitting in a glass-enclosed booth, was the venue's lead audiovisual technician. He was an employee of our property management firm, a man who answered directly to Jake's security team. I caught his eye through the glass window. I gave him a single sharp nod. The technician immediately went to work. The heavy velvet curtains draped across the back of the stage began to part, automatically pulled back by silent motorized tracks. Behind the curtains, a massive cinema-quality projection screen descended from the high ceiling. The mechanical whirring sound added a layer of industrial tension to the dead silent ballroom. The crowd watched in breathless anticipation. They thought they were attending a boring charity auction, but they had suddenly been thrust into the front row of a high society scandal. Every single person in the room leaned forward, their eyes glued to the descending white canvas. I lowered the microphone to my side. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my husband, our united front, an unbreakable wall of power and authority. We did not need to say another word. The evidence was about to speak for itself. The heavy projector mounted on the balcony railing flashed to life. A brilliant, blinding beam of white light cut through the dim atmosphere of the ballroom, hitting the massive screen directly behind us. The image flickered for a fraction of a second, adjusting its focus before locking into crystal clear, high-definition resolution. The document illuminated on the screen was massive, impossible to ignore, and absolutely devastating. Displayed in high definition across a 20-foot projector screen was a formal, legally binding notice of default and eviction. The bold black lettering at the top of the document was undeniable. Below it, the official seal of the state courts validated every single word printed on the page. The document named Logan's supposedly elite investment firm as the primary tenant. It named J&H Holdings as the sole property owner and undisputed landlord. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the historic ballroom. It was the sound of 300 wealthy, influential individuals simultaneously witnessing a total financial slaughter. The polite murmurs that had filled the room just minutes ago transformed into a frantic, chaotic buzz of disbelief. Hedge fund managers adjusted their glasses, squinting at the glowing screen to read the exact, humiliating details. Socialites covered their mouths with perfectly manicured hands, whispering frantically to one another. The carefully constructed, flawless facade of the Addams family was burning to the ground right in front of them, and everyone had a front-row seat to the inferno. I stood on the stage, the microphone resting comfortably in my grip. I did not rush. I allowed the crowd ample time to absorb the visual evidence of my brother's complete insolvency. When the murmurs reached a fever pitch, I raised the microphone back to my lips. My voice cut through the noise with the sharp clinical precision of a surgeon operating on a fatal wound. I directed the attention of the room to the second paragraph of the legal notice. I read the numbers aloud, making sure my enunciation was absolutely perfect. I announced that the boutique investment firm operated by my brother Logan currently owed exactly $1,245,000 to our commercial real estate division. The ballroom fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. A debt of over $1 million simply for office space was catastrophic. But I was not finished dismantling his ego. I looked directly at Logan, who was now sweating so profusely his designer shirt clung to his chest. I told the captive audience that Logan had not paid a single solitary dime of his commercial rent in 36 months. I explained that for 3 entire years he had been operating his business out of a luxury high-rise building completely free of charge. I clarified that my husband, the man my family had publicly and violently disrespected, had secretly subsidized 80% of that lease out of pure generosity. Jake had done it to spare my family from the very public humiliation they were currently experiencing. I kept my gaze locked on my brother. I informed the crowd that despite receiving an 80% discount on premium Boston real estate, Logan still failed to cover the remaining fraction of his operational costs. I exposed the fact that his investment firm held 0 liquid assets. I revealed that the expensive imported caviar they were eating tonight, the vintage champagne they were drinking, and the magnificent floral arrangements surrounding them had not been funded by a successful business. They had been funded by desperate, high-interest predatory loans secured just 48 hours ago from unregulated street lenders. The reaction from the crowd was explosive. Wealthy investors physically stepped away from Logan as if his bankruptcy was a highly contagious disease. They realized instantly that any money they had trusted to his firm was likely gone, swallowed up by his desperate attempts to maintain an illusion of grandeur. He was not a financial prodigy. He was a complete fraud running a massive failing shell game. I turned my attention to the front VIP table. I looked directly at Whitney's parents. The state senator sat rigid in his gold-backed chair. His face was a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were stark white. Beside him, his wife looked as though she was struggling to draw breath into her lungs. These were people who dealt in political leverage, public optics, and unshakable reputations. They had allowed their daughter to marry into my family because my parents had sold them a flawless narrative of old money stability and financial brilliance. They had paraded Logan around their elite East Coast circles, introducing him to powerful political donors and prominent hospital board executives. They had vouched for him. Now, looking at the towering projection screen, the senator realized the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He saw the irrefutable, legally binding proof that his son-in-law was entirely broke. Worse than broke, Logan was a toxic liability. The senator's political rivals would absolutely feast on this scandal. They would use Logan's fraudulent business practices to attack the senator's judgment and integrity. The connection to my brother was no longer a prestigious alliance. It was a political death sentence. The senator slowly turned his head to look at Logan. The look in his eyes was lethal. It was not just disappointment. It was the cold, calculating fury of a powerful man who had been played for an absolute fool. He looked at the sweating, trembling coward who had married his daughter and saw nothing but a parasitic liability. Whitney, standing near the back of the room in her ruined champagne-soaked designer gown, caught her father's eye. She let out a choked, desperate sob. She finally understood that her aristocratic reign over Boston society was permanently terminated. Her parents could not protect her from this level of financial devastation. Her husband was a hollow shell possessing nothing but debt and a repossessed luxury vehicle. I lowered the microphone slightly, letting the heavy, suffocating reality settle over the room. I had stripped away every single lie they had ever told. I had taken the elite stage they built to showcase their superiority and weaponized it to broadcast their destruction. But the financial autopsy was not quite complete. Logan's business was only half of the parasitic equation. I looked down at my mother, Brenda. She was still leaning against the marble pillar, completely paralyzed by the unfolding nightmare. She thought the worst was over. She thought exposing Logan's firm was the ultimate punishment. She had absolutely no idea that I was about to drop the final, most devastating piece of evidence right onto her own doorstep. I raised my hand and signaled the technician in the glass booth for the second time. The projector clicked, advancing to the next slide, ready to illuminate the collateral damage. The crisp click of the projector echoed through the silent ballroom. The massive screen behind me flashed, replacing the commercial eviction notice with a new, equally devastating legal document. This one was older, dated exactly 3 years ago, but the signatures at the bottom were fresh in the minds of everyone who knew my parents. The bold black text at the top read Deed of Trust and Cross-Collateralization Agreement. I raised the microphone, my voice echoing with unrelenting clarity. I asked the audience to direct their attention to the bottom of the projected page. I pointed out the elegant, sweeping handwriting of my mother, Brenda, and the sharp, aggressive signature of my father, Thomas. The notary stamps and official county seals glowed in high definition, leaving absolutely no room for denial. I explained that 3 years ago, when Logan first drove his boutique firm to the absolute brink of total bankruptcy, the commercial banks demanded hard physical collateral before they would even consider restructuring his massive toxic debt. I looked directly at my father. Thomas was standing rigid near the center of the room, surrounded by his peers. These were men he golfed with, men he drank expensive imported scotch, with men he had lied to every single day to maintain his facade of supreme financial dominance. I told the captive crowd that Thomas and Brenda did not have the liquid cash to save their golden child. Instead, they made a desperate, reckless gamble to preserve their fragile social standing. They tied the legal deed of their sprawling, historic Boston estate directly to the operational success of Logan's investment firm. They literally bet their house on a man who did not know how to generate a single dime of legitimate profit. The ballroom held its collective breath. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt physically suffocating. I stated the cold, undeniable facts of commercial lending. I explained that when a primary borrower completely defaults on a cross-collateralized loan, the bank does not just freeze the corporate accounts and send a strongly worded letter. The bank immediately seizes the physical collateral to satisfy the outstanding debt. I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the crowd before locking onto my mother's terrified face. I announced that because Logan had defaulted on his massive commercial obligations earlier this week, the protective buffer was officially gone. The bank had executed the collateral clause, but the bank no longer held the paper. I informed the room that J&H Holdings had purchased the distressed debt directly from the financial institution yesterday afternoon in a swift all-cash transaction. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Guests gasped out loud. The sound of rapid, frantic whispering filled the cavernous space. Several prominent socialites actually stepped back, physically distancing themselves from my parents, as if financial ruin were an airborne pathogen. I stated with absolute legal finality that the sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion my parents used to project their fake elite status no longer belonged to the Addams family trust. The estate, the manicured grounds, and every square inch of that property was now the exclusive legal property of J&H Holdings. The aristocratic facade of my father disintegrated entirely in real time. Thomas swayed on his feet, his face turning an alarming, sickly shade of gray. The men standing next to him, his supposed closest friends from the elite country club, did not reach out to steady him. They looked at him with profound, unmasked disgust. The illusion of his immense wealth was shattered, revealing a desperate, foolish man who had gambled his family home to fund a lie. Thomas raised a trembling hand and clutched his chest, grabbing the lapel of his rented tuxedo. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with a mixture of sheer panic and profound shame. He was completely humiliated in front of his peers, entirely stripped of the power and prestige he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. He was exposed not just as a financial failure, but as a reckless impostor who had bet his family's legacy on a fraud and lost everything in a spectacular public execution. He staggered backward, knocking into a high-top cocktail table, sending half-full glasses of expensive champagne, tipping dangerously close to the edge. While Thomas gasped for air under the crushing weight of public ruin, my brother decided to do what he always did best. He tried to run. I caught the sudden movement out of the corner of my eye. Logan had abandoned his spot near the catering display. He was keeping his head down, his shoulders hunched desperately, trying to weave his way through the dense crowd of stunned guests toward the heavy brass exit doors at the rear of the ballroom. He wanted to escape the suffocating humiliation. He wanted to leave his furious wife, his ruined parents, and his massive debts behind and disappear into the freezing Boston night. He moved with frantic, jerky steps, shoving past a group of bewildered state senators, his eyes locked entirely on the polished brass handles of freedom. He was sweating profusely, his face shiny and pale, as he pushed through the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. But Jake had anticipated the cowardice. My husband stood at the edge of the stage, his arms still casually crossed, but his eyes tracking Logan's every panicked move. Jake raised his right hand, giving a subtle, sharp hand signal to the perimeter of the room. The two towering security guards who had earlier bowed to Jake moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They cut through the crowd effortlessly and stepped directly in front of the grand brass doors. As Logan lunged for the exit, his face pale with panic and desperation, he slammed squarely into a wall of solid muscle and tailored black suits. The guards did not lay a hand on him, but they firmly blocked his path, crossing their arms over their broad chests. Their expressions were completely devoid of sympathy. Logan stumbled backward, his chest heaving, his escape route totally severed. He was completely trapped inside the opulent ballroom, physically locked in, to face the absolute devastation of his own making, with hundreds of Boston's most elite citizens watching his every pathetic move. I left Logan physically trapped at the heavy brass exit doors. The entire ballroom had just watched him fail to escape his own disaster. I turned my attention away from my cowardly brother and looked back at the center of the room. The absolute devastation of my family's fraudulent empire was now broadcast for every prominent politician, hedge fund manager, and wealthy socialite in Boston to witness. The air in the historic venue felt charged thick with the intoxicating electricity of a complete power shift. I stepped toward the edge of the elevated stage. The heavy fabric of my emerald green gown cascaded beautifully as I descended the 3 carpeted steps. My high heels clicked against the polished wood, each step sounding like a metronome ticking down the final seconds of my mother's fabricated reality. As my shoes met the cold marble floor of the grand ballroom, the sea of elite guests instinctively parted. Wealthy donors and state senators physically stepped backward, clearing a wide, unobstructed path for me. They looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and newfound absolute respect. Hours ago, I was an uninvited ghost. Now I was the undisputed architect of the most brutal financial takedown Boston high society had ever seen. Jake stepped down from the stage a moment later, walking 2 paces behind me. His presence was a silent, lethal shadow, ensuring that absolutely no one dared to intervene. I walked with slow, deliberate precision. My destination was the towering marble pillar near the center of the room. My mother, Brenda, was standing exactly where I had left her. The transformation of her physical appearance was staggering. The arrogant, shrieking woman who had violently slapped my husband on Christmas Day was entirely gone. The imposing matriarch, who had commanded security to throw me out into the freezing snow just 30 minutes ago, had completely vanished. In her place stood a terrified, trembling, broken old woman. She was leaning heavily against a high-top cocktail table, using both of her arms to support her own body weight. Her knuckles were bone white as she gripped the edges of the table. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. The expensive sapphire velvet gown she wore suddenly looked ridiculous, a cheap costume draped over a fraudulent actress who had forgotten her lines. Her perfectly styled hair had fallen flat, and her meticulous makeup could not hide the sickly ashen gray color that had drained every ounce of life from her face. She watched me approach. Her eyes were wide, dilated with pure, unadulterated panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely dry. No sound emerged. She looked frantically around the room, desperately searching the faces of her wealthy friends and country club associates for a single shred of sympathy or support. She found none. The elite society she had worshipped her entire life was looking back at her with profound, unmasked disgust. They saw her not as a peer, but as a toxic liability. A liar who had gambled away her family estate to fund a scam. She was entirely alone in a room filled with 300 people. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of her. The proximity was suffocating, but I did not afford her the luxury of distance. I looked down at her. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of daughterly obligation that had chained me to her demands for over 3 decades. The emotional manipulation that had forced me to fix her, bounce checks, override her credit limits, and sacrifice my own peace of mind was completely dead. Brenda finally managed to draw a ragged breath. Her voice, when it broke the silence, was a pathetic, trembling whisper. She choked out my name. She stammered that I had made my point. She begged me to stop the presentation, promising that she would do anything I wanted. She whispered frantically that we could go into a private room and discuss a payment plan, insisting that she could sell her jewelry or ask her country club friends for a temporary bridge loan. She was still trying to bargain. She genuinely believed that this was just an aggressive negotiation tactic. She could not comprehend the absolute finality of her destruction. She thought that because I was her daughter, I would eventually clean up the mess and save her from the consequences of her own actions. She thought the rules of high finance could be bent by maternal guilt. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or engage in a desperate shouting match. I kept my face perfectly blank, a mirror reflecting her total ruin. I reached into my custom emerald clutch. My fingers brushed against the thick, rigid cardstock of the legal document waiting inside. I grasped the crisp white envelope and pulled it slowly into the light of the crystal chandeliers. The envelope was identical to the one waiting on Logan's desk. It bore the bright red official legal stamp of our corporate attorneys. It carried the undeniable weight of state law and undeniable financial reality. The paper was pristine, a stark contrast to the messy, debt-fueled chaos of my parents' lives. Brenda stared at the envelope. Her eyes tracked the movement of my hand, as if I were holding a loaded weapon. Her breathing hitched, a sharp, terrified sound catching in the back of her throat. She knew exactly what it was. She had seen the cross-collateralization documents projected on the massive screen just moments ago. She knew her sprawling historic mansion was no longer legally hers. I reached out and gently took hold of her trembling right hand. I pried her fingers away from the edge of the cocktail table. Her skin was freezing cold, slick with the sweat of sheer panic. She tried to pull her hand away, shaking her head in silent, frantic denial, but my grip was firm and unyielding. The power dynamic between us had irreversibly flipped. The woman who used to control my every move was now completely at my mercy, and she realized I possessed none. I pressed the thick white envelope firmly into her palm. I closed her shaking fingers over the heavy paper, ensuring she was physically holding the absolute proof of her downfall. The entire ballroom was holding its breath. The silence was deafening. Every single prominent guest, every politician, and every socialite watched the exchange with captivated, horrified fascination. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. They were witnessing the brutal surgical dismantling of an entire family legacy. I looked directly into my mother's terrified, tear-filled eyes. I delivered the final fatal blow with a voice so cold and completely devoid of mercy that it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "This is your formal eviction notice." The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. Brenda stared down at the thick white envelope clutched in her trembling fingers, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She tried to speak. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords completely seized. Her entire body shook with the violent realization that her majestic reign over Boston high society had just been permanently terminated. I did not whisper the next part. I did not pull her aside into a private alcove. I did not attempt to spare her any of the public humiliation she was currently experiencing. She had never afforded me a single ounce of grace, and I was absolutely not going to offer it to her now. I pitched my voice perfectly. I ensured that it carried clearly across the dead silent ballroom. Every state senator, every hedge fund manager, every elite socialite standing within a 50-foot radius heard every single syllable of my legal decree. I explained the timeline of her destruction with the clinical precision of a corporate executioner. I wanted the wealthy audience to understand exactly how thoroughly J&H Holdings had dismantled the Addams family empire. I stated that the commercial banking division of our company had already taken full possession of the deed to their historic estate. I clarified that the cross-collateralization agreement they had signed 3 years ago was ironclad, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation appeals or desperate legal maneuvers. "You have 72 hours to vacate the commercial office space," I announced, my voice slicing effortlessly through the heavy tension of the grand ballroom. I watched the brutal mathematics register in her terrified, wide eyes. 72 hours. It was barely a weekend. It was not enough time to secure a fraudulent bridge loan. It was not enough time to hire an aggressive defense attorney. It was barely enough time to pack Logan's mahogany desk into cheap cardboard boxes before my security team physically locked the doors to his corporate suite. The investment firm that had served as the crown jewel of her social bragging rights was effectively dead. And 30 days, I continued taking a deliberate step closer to her trembling frame to surrender the keys to your home. The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was intoxicating. 30 days. The reality of that timeline crashed into Brenda with the force of a physical blow. The sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion where she had hosted her elite book clubs, the manicured lawns where she threw extravagant summer garden parties, the sweeping staircases she descended in her designer gowns. All of it was completely gone. She was effectively homeless, surviving on a strict 30-day countdown clock, dictated entirely by the daughter she had deemed a pathetic failure. She looked at me, a silent, desperate plea forming in her eyes. She wanted me to take it back. She wanted me to smile, tell the crowd it was a practical joke, and return her to her comfortable, luxurious delusion. She wanted the obedient, compliant Hannah to step in and clean up the mess. I offered her nothing but a blank, unforgiving stare. "Make sure you pack carefully, Mom," I stated, letting the title roll off my tongue. The word Mom felt completely foreign now. It was no longer a term of endearment. It was a cold, clinical designation for a woman I simply used to know. I reminded her that any permanent fixtures, any valuable art, any built-in amenities left behind after the 30-day grace period would be instantly liquidated by our asset management team. I warned her not to attempt to strip the mansion bare or cause malicious damage to the property on her way out. I made it abundantly clear that my legal team would be conducting a thorough, aggressive inspection on the 31st day. If so much as a single crystal chandelier was missing, I would not hesitate to file criminal charges for property theft. She would not be allowed to pawn my assets to fund her impending bankruptcy. The wealthy guests watching the exchange physically recoiled. They looked at Brenda with profound, unmasked disgust. In their ruthless, ultra-competitive world, poverty was a sin, but being exposed as a massive, arrogant fraud was the ultimate unforgivable crime. They saw her not as a peer, but as a toxic, radioactive liability. At the front table, Whitney's powerful political parents were absolutely horrified. The state senator stood up from his chair, his face a mask of furious indignation. He gestured sharply to his wife, silently commanding her to gather her things. They were abandoning ship. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Addams family, and their swift departure sealed Logan and Whitney's fate permanently. Brenda saw them standing up. She saw the elite society she had worshipped her entire life actively turning their backs on her. She reached out her shaking hand, hovering in the air, as if she could physically grab the evaporating prestige and pull it back to her chest. Her sapphire velvet gown suddenly looked absurd, a cheap costume draped over an exposed impostor. She had gambled everything on the golden child, and she had lost spectacularly. I looked at the ruined shell of my mother. I let my eyes sweep over her expensive jewelry, her designer shoes, and all the opulent trappings of a fraudulent life I had single-handedly funded. Then I slowly turned my head and looked back at my husband. Jake stood tall and unbothered under the glare of the crystal chandeliers. He did not look smug or arrogant. He radiated the kind of absolute quiet power that comes from building a massive empire with your own two hands. He was a man of immense strength, unmatched intelligence, and undeniable wealth. He was the man she had violently struck on Christmas Day because she believed he was beneath her. I turned back to my mother. I locked my eyes directly onto hers, ensuring she would remember this exact moment for the rest of her miserable, bankrupt life. I delivered the final lethal blow with perfect, devastating clarity. Because the trailer trash you slapped on Christmas just officially bought your entire life. The final word echoed through the silent ballroom, hanging in the cold, conditioned air, like the suffocating smoke after a gunshot. I stepped back, severing the intense eye contact with my mother, allowing the brutal reality of my statement to fully detonate. The explosion was not physical. It was entirely social, legal, and financial, and the blast radius covered every single member of my former family. The paralyzing silence of the venue finally shattered. A chaotic cacophony of gasps, frantic whispers, and the loud scraping of chairs erupted across the historic ballroom. The Boston elite, usually so composed and fiercely protective of their restrained public image, completely abandoned their aristocratic manners. They were witnessing a legendary catastrophic implosion, and human nature demanded a front-row seat to the carnage. Dozens of guests pulled out their smartphones. The harsh, bright flashes of camera lenses began illuminating the dim ballroom, capturing the exact moment the Addams family legacy was permanently eradicated. Whitney was the first to break the paralysis. The aristocratic composure she had wielded like a weapon her entire life completely dissolved into pure feral panic. She spun around, her designer heels crunching loudly over the shattered crystal of her dropped champagne flute. She lunged toward Logan, her hands curling into frantic claws as she grabbed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit. She screamed. It was a visceral, unhinged sound that echoed violently off the gilded ceiling. She demanded to know if it was true. She shook him with surprising force, screaming that he had lied to her about his portfolios, his assets, and his entire existence. Logan could not even formulate a coherent sentence. He stammered pathetically, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he desperately tried to peel her manicured fingers off his expensive jacket. He begged her to lower her voice, insisting they could fix this privately. Whitney slapped his hands away. Her voice reached a shrill, hysterical pitch that easily carried over the murmuring crowd. She shrieked that there was nothing to fix because he was completely broke. She declared right then and there in front of 300 horrified members of high society that she was contacting her family's legal team first thing in the morning. She demanded an immediate absolute divorce. She told him that she would rather die than be legally tied to a fraudulent, penniless coward who had to beg his estranged sister to pay his office rent. At the front VIP table, Whitney's powerful political parents acted with swift, ruthless self-preservation. The state senator did not walk over to comfort his distressed daughter. He did not offer a helping hand to Thomas, the man he had called a close friend just an hour prior. The senator stood up, his face a mask of furious, cold calculation. He signaled his wife with a sharp, decisive tilt of his head. They were abandoning ship, actively severing any ties to the toxic radiation of Logan's impending bankruptcy. Thomas tried to intercept them. My father stumbled forward, his face pale and slick with the sweat of sheer panic. He reached out his hands in a pathetic, desperate gesture of appeasement. He pleaded with the senator, stammering rapid apologies and promising that this was all a massive misunderstanding that he could easily explain over a round of golf tomorrow morning. The senator did not stop walking. He looked at Thomas with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. He flatly stated that Thomas was a toxic liability, a massive political hazard, and ordered him to never contact their family again. The senator and his wife swept past Thomas as if he were entirely invisible, their private security detail forging a path directly toward the heavy brass exit doors. They abandoned the gala without a backward glance, completely severing the political alliance that had been the ultimate crown jewel of my parents' manufactured reality. Thomas stood frozen in the center of the aisle, his arms still outstretched, watching his political leverage walk out the door forever. He clutched his chest, the reality of his total social and financial ruin finally breaking his arrogant spirit. He looked like an empty, hollow shell of a man stripped of his country club prestige and left exposed to the judging eyes of the city. I turned my attention back to the marble pillar. Brenda had watched the entire sequence unfold. She had watched her golden daughter-in-law demand a divorce in front of the cameras. She had watched her powerful political connections walk out in absolute disgust, treating her husband like a diseased outcast. She saw the glowing screens of smartphones recording her humiliation, capturing the violent death of her social standing in high definition. The sheer crushing weight of the absolute truth finally broke her legs. The illusion she had maintained for decades dissolved into nothingness. Her knees violently buckled beneath the heavy, expensive fabric of her sapphire velvet gown. She collapsed. She fell directly into the puddle of spilled champagne and the jagged, glittering shards of Whitney's shattered crystal flute. The sharp glass crunched audibly beneath her weight, but she did not even seem to feel the physical pain. The emotional devastation was entirely consuming. She covered her face with her trembling hands and began to sob. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical sound completely devoid of the dignity or grace she had always pretended to possess. She knelt on the cold marble floor, weeping uncontrollably amidst the ruins of her fake empire. She rocked back and forth, the flashing cameras capturing her total collapse. The matriarch of the Addams family was officially dethroned. She had gambled her home, her finances, and her relationship with her only daughter to fund a glorious lie, and now she was forced to face the brutal consequences. She had finally realized, surrounded by the judging stares of the elite society she so desperately worshipped, that she had lost absolutely everything. I stared down at the woman kneeling in the shattered crystal and spilled champagne. For 34 years, this was the exact moment where my deeply ingrained programming would violently kick in. The suffocating conditioning that demanded I drop to my knees, put my arms around her trembling shoulders, and promise to fix the completely unfixable. Under normal circumstances, I would have pulled out my phone, called my banking contacts, and negotiated a desperate, frantic way to save her dignity and preserve the family illusion. But as I watched her weep on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the judging stares of the elite society she worshipped, that familiar urge was completely absent. The panicked voice in my head that always whispered I was solely responsible for their survival had been permanently silenced. I did not reach out my hand to comfort her. I did not step forward to shield her from the flashing camera lenses of the wealthy socialites who were actively documenting her absolute destruction. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no sorrow. The daughter who fixed everything, the reliable human shield, who absorbed their debts and their vicious insults, was officially retired. I was just a woman watching a stranger face the natural, unavoidable consequences of a lifetime of cruelty and arrogance. I turned my head and looked at Jake. He was already watching me, his dark eyes radiating a quiet, unshakable pride. He did not need to ask if I was okay, or if I wanted to stay and help them pick up the pieces. He knew the cord was officially severed. He stepped forward and offered me his arm. I slid my hand through the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid, comforting strength of the man my family had so foolishly underestimated. We turned our backs on the weeping matriarch, the paralyzed patriarch, and the cowardly brother who was still physically trapped by the exit doors. We did not offer a single word of parting. As we moved toward the main entrance of the grand ballroom, the head of security gave a sharp, decisive hand signal. The massive guards in black suits stepped forward in perfect unison, smoothly parting the chaotic sea of wealthy guests, stunned politicians, and frantic photographers. The Boston elite scrambled out of our way, clearing a wide, unobstructed path for the true owners of the venue. We walked out of the ballroom with our heads held high, leaving the smoldering ruins of a deeply toxic family entirely behind us. The heavy brass doors swung shut abruptly, cutting off the hysterical sobbing and the frantic shouting of the failed charity gala. The biting winter wind of the Boston night hit my face the second we stepped out onto the marble portico, but it felt incredibly pure and refreshing. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of my family's manufactured drama was instantly washed away by the freezing air. We descended the sweeping exterior steps and climbed into our waiting car. Jake started the engine, the powerful, steady hum of the vehicle providing a stark contrast to the absolute silence between us. He smoothly navigated away from the curb, steering us away from the epicenter of the financial slaughter we had just orchestrated. I leaned my head against the cool leather of the passenger seat and watched the glittering city skyline pass by my window. The streetlights illuminated the falling snow, creating a peaceful, quiet rhythm. I waited for the inevitable wave of regret or residual guilt to hit me, but it never arrived. There was only a profound, weightless sense of relief stretching endlessly in front of me. I would never again receive a panicked phone call at 7 in the morning demanding a credit override. I would never again be forced to endure thinly veiled insults about my husband at a holiday dinner. I would never again have to shrink myself down to make room for my brother's inflated ego. I was finally truly free. We pulled into the wide driveway of our own home. The warm, inviting lights glowed softly through the frost-covered windows, a beacon of actual legitimate security. We stepped inside, shrugging off our heavy winter coats and leaving the bitter cold behind. The house was blissfully quiet, entirely devoid of the toxic, frantic energy that defined my parents' world. We walked silently up the carpeted stairs and pushed open the door to Lily's bedroom. Our 7-year-old daughter was fast asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful, her small arms wrapped tightly around her stuffed bear. She was entirely safe. She would grow up in a home built on genuine love, mutual respect, and honest hard work. She would be entirely protected from the generational manipulation and status-obsessed cruelty that had plagued my own childhood. Jake and I shared a long look in the dim light of the nursery, a silent mutual acknowledgement of the beautiful reality we had defended today. We quietly closed her door and walked downstairs to the kitchen. Jake walked over to the dark mahogany liquor cabinet tucked into the corner of our dining area. He retrieved a bottle of top-tier aged whiskey and 2 heavy crystal tumblers. He poured the rich amber liquid that sounded smooth and deeply satisfying in the quiet space of our home. He walked back over to the kitchen island and handed me a glass. We stood together in the center of our kitchen, the undisputed architects of our own destiny. We looked at each other, acknowledging the incredible empire we had built from nothing and the fierce boundaries we had just violently enforced. We clinked our heavy crystal glasses together, the sharp, clear ring sealing our absolute victory. Taking a slow sip of the burning whiskey, I knew with complete certainty that they would never bother us again. We were absolutely free, financially victorious, and entirely untouchable. The most powerful lesson from this journey is that your self-worth is never determined by someone else's inability to recognize it. True family, whether biological or chosen, builds you up and respects you, rather than using guilt or manipulation to control you. Walking away from a toxic environment isn't giving up. It is giving yourself permission to heal. You do not owe your peace of mind to anyone who consistently disrespects you or the people you love. Protect your boundaries because your truth matters even when others try to deny it. Have you ever had to set firm boundaries with people who didn't appreciate your true self? How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below. Remember to hit like and subscribe for more stories about resilience, healing, and finding the strength to choose yourself when others will not.